Tonight, we begin with a subject both scandalous and scholarly, the intimate, confusing, and occasionally downright bizarre world of medieval sex. It was an era of chivalry and deeply suspicious herbal remedies, a time when foreplay often meant asking politely and hoping no one was watching. If you thought modern dating was complicated, imagine trying to impress someone when your main flirting tool was a lute and a prayer. Hey guys, and welcome back to Echoes in Time. Before you get comfortable, if you enjoy these trips into the grittier, more surprising side of history, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start by shattering the biggest misconception. Medieval intimacy did not unfold beneath silk sheets in candlelit chambers while a lute played softly in the background. In reality, for the vast majority of people, the setting was usually a small, single-room home shared by an entire family, including children, aging relatives, a couple of goats, and a chicken who had strong opinions about personal space. Privacy, as we think of it, simply didn't exist. Most peasants lived in wattle and daub huts where the kitchen, bedroom, and stable were technically the same square footage, just with different smells. If a married couple wanted some alone time, they had to get creative, patient, and very quiet. Timing mattered, volume mattered, and ideally, so did whether the kids were asleep and dutifully facing the wall. Curtains around a bed were a luxury. Beds themselves were often just straw-stuffed mattresses on the floor, shared by multiple family members for warmth. Even among the upper classes, true privacy was a rare commodity. A lord and lady might have their own bedchamber, but servants might be asleep on pallets at the foot of their bed, or standing in a corner, pretending with all their might not to notice anything. Many noble households kept detailed records of bedroom arrangements for legal or religious reasons, which is exactly as awkward as it sounds. Traveling didn't help. Inns often featured large, shared beds. That's right, you might find yourself sleeping side by side with a complete stranger for the night, which made romantic encounters even more complicated. Want a little affection with your spouse? You'd better check if there's already a traveling merchant in the bed, and whether or not he brought his boots with him. For those living in monasteries or convents, the rule was simple. No privacy, no distractions, and certainly no late-night whispers. But even there, human nature occasionally made things complicated, which might explain why many abbeys had unusually high garden walls. In the medieval world, the first rule of romance was accepting that you were probably not alone. In the medieval world, few institutions shaped private life more than the church, and it had a lot to say about what went on behind closed doors, or, more accurately, behind shared curtains. According to the dominant church teachings of the time, physical intimacy had one, and only one, primary legitimate function: procreation, making more little Christians. That was it. Not pleasure, not bonding, not stress relief, just reproduction. Everything else was seen as distracting at best, and deeply sinful at worst. This wasn't just Sunday sermon material. Bishops, theologians, and confessors wrote detailed instructions, or penitentials, outlining precisely what was and wasn't acceptable, just in case anyone dared to improvise. The preferred, and often only, permissible method was what we now call the missionary position. It was deemed the most natural for procreation, and therefore the least likely to offend God, the saints, or your local priest. Anything else, any variation that might hint at a pursuit of pleasure over duty, was considered suspect, unnatural, and potentially sinful. That includes things like enthusiasm. One 13th century guide for married couples suggested that they should engage in intimacy without pleasure, without sin, and without delay, which is, By all accounts, a fairly joyless checklist. Another theologian, Saint Jerome, argued that a man who was too ardent a lover of his own wife was, in fact, an adulterer. The ideal was to approach the marital act with a sense of pious duty, not passion, and the Church didn't just have opinions on how, it had very strong opinions on when. If you think modern couples have trouble syncing their schedules, spare a thought for medieval folks. Planning a romantic evening required a calendar, a priest's blessing, and the luck of Saint Valentine himself. Sundays were absolutely off limits. That was the Lord's Day. Fridays were also out, as a day of penance in memory of the crucifixion. Wednesdays were often forbidden as well. Add to that the entire season of Lent, 40 days, the season of Advent, another 40 days, and various major feast days, fast days, and holy days, and you'll find the calendar was less of a schedule and more of a divine obstacle course. Some confession manuals outlined nearly half the year as off-limits for marital relations. If you were feeling particularly affectionate during one of those forbidden days, well, enjoy your spiritual guilt and an extra long trip to confession. Of course, the upper classes, with their personal chaplains and confessors, were more exposed to these strictures. Peasants, meanwhile, whose lives revolved around the rhythms of agriculture, livestock, and not freezing to death, often had a more flexible and pragmatic approach. Still, the shadow of the Church loomed large over the medieval bedroom, attempting to regulate not just actions, but desires themselves. If the Church's rulebook wasn't complicated enough, navigating courtship in the Middle Ages was like playing a game of chess, where all the pieces were invisible and the rules changed depending on who was watching. For most people, especially outside the peasantry, marriage was primarily a business deal. Daughters were exchanged to cement political alliances, acquire property, or secure peace between two families who had previously disagreed over whose pig ate whose prize-winning cabbage. A bride might come with a dowry of coin, linens, or a small patch of highly desirable farmland. In return, the groom's family might promise financial security, social advancement, or just to be generally less insufferable. Romantic love, while not unheard of, was considered a happy bonus, not a prerequisite. As one medieval proverb more or less stated, better a wealthy match with a grumpy face than a poor one with dimples. Courtship, when it happened at all, was a highly supervised affair. Young people rarely, if ever, courted alone. A maiden of good standing would be watched over by her mother, a stern aunt, or, if things got really serious, an entire village that was very invested in whether or not you held hands for too long. This doesn't mean love and attraction didn't exist. It just meant people had to get creative. A whole coded language of romance developed, one built on subtle gestures, hidden meanings, and plausible deniability. Take eye contact. For example, in modern romance, we're told it builds connection. In medieval Europe, it could build suspicion, an engagement contract, or a lawsuit, depending on how long you held it. Too brief, and you seemed uninterested. Too long, and you were essentially proposing marriage, or challenging her father to a duel. Manuals on courtly love advise that a man should gaze softly, yet sincerely, a phrase that sounds like something from a 14th century perfume ad. The ideal stare was somewhere between, "I deeply admire your embroidery skills," and "I am not currently planning to invade your family's estate." Poetry was another popular tool, especially for the socially awkward noble who had more access to ink than to charm. But here's the twist. The most acceptable way to express affection wasn't by praising your beloved's beauty directly. That was too worldly. Instead, you were advised to compare her to divine figures, ideally the Virgin Mary, because nothing says, "I want to court you modestly," like you remind me of the Holy Mother of God. These poems were often deeply religious, partly to appease the Church, and partly so that if things went wrong, you could just claim the poem was meant for a nun. And what about gifts? While modern dating might involve flowers or chocolates, a popular gesture of love in medieval Europe was a recently deceased woodland creature. To demonstrate bravery, masculinity, and excellent aim, knights frequently gifted their beloveds the spoils of the hunt. A bouquet of roses was nice, but a freshly slain boar's head, still slightly steaming. That was the real way to say, "I think about you when I'm throwing spears at things." This wasn't considered strange. In fact, it was encouraged. A lady receiving a skinned rabbit was expected to act delighted, even if she was internally wondering where to store her third hare of the week. If this all sounds incredibly complicated, you're not wrong. Medieval romance was a minefield of unspoken rules, religious anxiety, and very, very public expectations. If you are fascinated by this bizarre world of medieval dating rituals, please take a moment to hit the like button. It tells me you enjoy these deep dives into the intimate and often strange side of history. Let's clear up one of the most persistent and frankly, weirdest legends about medieval relationships: chastity belts. Yes, you've probably seen them in cartoons, historical dramas, or very unfortunate museum gift shops. Those iron contraptions, allegedly locked around a woman's waist while her husband went off to war or on a pilgrimage, designed to keep her physically and morally sealed, except not really. There is no solid historical evidence that chastity belts were ever widely used in the Middle Ages. In fact, most of the examples we have today actually come from the Renaissance, or even the 19th century Victorian era, periods that were more obsessed with the idea of medieval repression than with what actually happened. Many of these belts were likely created as joke items for cabinets of curiosities, as satirical warnings against infidelity, or as outright forgeries to sell to gullible collectors. Medieval manuscripts, which often record all sorts of uncomfortable and intimate details of daily life, are suspiciously silent about mass belt distribution. No tailors advertised custom fittings, no laws regulated their use, and no churches handed them out during awkward pre-crusade marriage ceremonies. It's almost as if, and stay with me here, they weren't actually a thing, which makes perfect sense, because the design is wildly impractical. Medieval hygiene was already questionable. Now imagine adding a rusty, chafing metal contraption with no user manual and a padlock that would probably require a blacksmith to open. It would have caused far more infections than it ever prevented indiscretions. So where did the myth come from? Likely from a combination of later moral panic and satire. Renaissance moralists and Victorian historians loved the image of a repressed, over-controlled medieval woman. It fit their narrative of the Dark Ages, and nothing says virtue enforced like a literal keyhole in your underpants. In reality, fidelity was enforced through more traditional and far more effective means: shame, constant surveillance, religious doctrine, and strategic matchmaking. Noble women were often chaperoned within an inch of their lives. Peasant girls had entire villages watching them like a team of unpaid private investigators. Any whiff of scandal could lead to a ruined reputation, a lost dowry, or an awkward confession involving phrases like "at the edge of the barley field." So while the idea of a chastity belt is a powerful one, it tells us more about later centuries' anxieties than it does about the medieval reality. In a surprising twist that would shock many of their modern descendants, medieval towns didn't just tolerate brothels. In many cases, they regulated them as legal, tax-paying businesses. This pragmatic approach stemmed from a cynical but common belief among officials: allowing a controlled outlet for men's desires would reduce the chances of greater sins, like assault, adultery with respectable women, or, heaven forbid, dancing on feast days. Regulated brothels were seen as a necessary evil to keep society orderly. The church, of course, officially condemned the entire practice, but unofficially, many clergy and city officials turned a blind eye, and some even collected rent from the very same establishments. If that sounds like hypocrisy, congratulations. You've grasped the essence of medieval public policy. Let's set the scene. Candlelight flickering. Your beloved whispers sweet nothings, and then removes their woolen tunic to reveal a powerful medieval musk. When it came to personal hygiene, medieval Europe had priorities. Staying clean was on the list, just somewhere after surviving the plague and catching the pig that got into the pantry again. Bathing did happen, but not nearly as often as modern noses would hope. Peasants might bathe once a month, more if they fell into a river. Soap was expensive and used sparingly. Even public bathhouses, which did exist, were sometimes banned during outbreaks of disease. Now, imagine trying to impress someone under these conditions. Perfume, mostly for the elite. Deodorant, a dream of the distant future. Dental care, you might rub your teeth with ash or chew on mint leaves. Kissing was certainly an adventure, and yet people still found ways to fall in love. Flirt and get close. Perhaps our standards were different. Or perhaps, when everyone smelled equally of wood smoke, sweat, and mild disappointment, love was truly blind and nose-blind. Despite what church authorities like to pretend, not every medieval couple waited until the wedding bells rang. Premarital intimacy was common enough that local courts had a whole system of fines for it. And what about same-sex attraction? It absolutely existed. We have records of love poems, letters, and deep emotional bonds between people of the same sex, particularly in the single-sex environments of monasteries and convents. Officially, it was a sin. In reality, life was, as always, much messier. So, after all this, the arranged marriages, the fines for flirting, the suspicious herbal remedies, the public bath habits, and the church warnings against smiling too much, you might be wondering, did medieval people actually fall in love? The answer is a resounding yes. Awkwardly, passionately, and sometimes even happily. Despite the rigid social structures and the moral sermons, love found a way to bloom in the cracks. Peasant couples courted in fields and marketplaces, trading favors, flowers, and whispered gossip over turnips. Noble lovers exchanged intricate poems and secret glances during formal banquets, while pretending to be fascinated by a long speech about falconry. We have their letters. Letters between spouses, especially during times of war or long separation, show real affection, deep longing, and profound commitment. We have records of couples who defied their parents to marry for love, and widows who remarried not for land, but for companionship. Because even after all the rules, the risks, and the rituals, the fundamental human need for connection remained. People still wanted to feel loved, to build a life with someone, to find a partner to endure the hardships of a difficult world with. The path to love was certainly different. It was more public, more practical, and fraught with far more rules about what you could do on a Tuesday. But the destination, a shared life, a deep bond, a sense of belonging to another person, was remarkably the same. What do you think is the biggest difference between medieval romance and dating today? Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the surprisingly complicated heart of the Middle Ages. If you found it fascinating, please subscribe and share. Until next time, stay curious. It all began with a disaster, not in a quiet library or a grand lecture hall, but in the chaos of a violent storm at sea. Zeno of Citium, a wealthy Phoenician merchant, had it all ships loaded with precious dyes, trade routes mapped across the Mediterranean, and the kind of fortune that made a man feel invincible. But fate, as ancient philosophers love to remind us, doesn't care how many ships you own. Somewhere near the coast of Athens, Zeno's entire fleet was swallowed by the sea. One moment, he was a merchant prince. The next, a man with nothing but the wet clothes on his back. When he finally washed ashore, he was broke, shipwrecked, and on the verge of discovering something far more enduring than any earthly treasure. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Echoes in Time. Tonight, we're not exploring a battle or a kingdom, but an idea, a philosophy forged not in comfort, but in crisis, designed to help us navigate the wreckage of our lives. This is the story of Stoicism. Before we begin, if you enjoy explorations of the timeless wisdom that can help us live better lives, please take a moment to subscribe and ring the bell. And I have a question for you. When you face a major setback in your life, what is your first reaction? Is it anger, despair, or something else? Let me know in the comments below. Now, let's travel back to ancient Athens, to a painted porch where a philosophy of resilience was born. After losing everything, Zeno wandered into Athens and found his way to a bookshop in the Agora, the city's bustling public square. There, he picked up a copy of Xenophon's Memorabilia, a text preserving the dialogues of Socrates. He was captivated. He asked the bookseller where he could find a man like Socrates today. The bookseller simply pointed to a stooped, famously cranky philosopher named Crates the Cynic, who happened to be walking by. And so, Zeno's new life began. He became a student of Crates, a man known for rejecting wealth and possessions with almost theatrical dedication. The Cynics believed that happiness was found by living a life of virtue in agreement with nature, which meant rejecting all conventional desires for wealth, power, or fame. It was a harsh, ascetic path, and at first, Zeno struggled. But Crates planted a seed in his mind, one that would grow into a new and powerful worldview. Over time, Zeno began to piece together his own philosophy, borrowing Socratic ethics, Cynic discipline, and the logical rigor of earlier thinkers. Eventually, he began teaching not in a formal academy, but in a public space, the Stoa Poikile, or painted porch, a covered colonnade in the Athenian Agora, decorated with murals of historical and mythological battles. That is where Stoicism got its name, not from an ivory tower, but from a public porch open to all. At the heart of Zeno's philosophy was a powerful idea, logos. To the Stoics, logos wasn't just logic or reason. It was the divine, rational, and providential order of the entire universe, the cosmic blueprint. They believed that everything that happens, from the rising of the sun to the shipwreck that ruins your life, happens for a reason within this grand, rational plan. The world, as messy and chaotic as it seems, is fundamentally ordered. The goal of a human life, then, is to live in harmony with this cosmic order. From this central idea came the core of Stoic ethics. Zeno and his followers taught that virtue, arete in Greek, meaning excellence of character, was the only true good. Not wealth, not health, not reputation, not even pleasure. Those things were indifferents. They were external to us, and therefore not essential to our happiness. It might be preferable to be healthy rather than sick, or wealthy rather than poor. But these things could not, in themselves, make you a good or bad person. What truly mattered was how you used them, how you reacted to them. This led to the famous Stoic dichotomy of control. You cannot control external events, but you can always control your thoughts, your judgments, and your responses to those events. Their favorite analogy was that of a dog tied to a moving cart. The dog can either choose to run along with the cart, moving in harmony with its direction, or it can dig in its heels and be painfully dragged along. Either way, the cart is going forward. Your choice is simply whether you move with it gracefully or with suffering. This was a radical idea. In a world that chased comfort, status, and power, Stoicism offered a quieter, more resilient path. Live in accordance with nature, accept fate without resentment, and strive only to be a person of good character. Zeno's quiet wisdom began to attract followers. Soon, a school of thought was flourishing on that painted porch, a philosophy designed not to win debates, but to build better human beings. If Zeno was the founder who laid the cornerstone of Stoicism, his successor, Cleanthes, was the man who gave it its strength and endurance. Cleanthes was not your typical philosopher. Before he ever stood beneath the painted porch, he was a boxer, a pugilist who earned his living through sheer physical toughness. When he discovered Zeno's teachings, he found a different kind of strength, one that could brace the soul. He was reportedly so poor that he worked by night, carrying water for a gardener, just so he could spend his days studying philosophy. His hands were calloused, His muscles were worn from labor, but his mind was unshakable. Cleanthes embodied the Stoic belief that virtue comes not from privilege, but from perseverance and hard work, or ponos. He didn't speak of theories he hadn't tested in the laboratory of his own life. If Zeno taught that one should accept hardship with grace, Cleanthes lived it with every sunrise. His most famous surviving work, the Hymn to Zeus, is a beautiful, poetic tribute to the Stoic concept of logos. But this wasn't religious flattery. It was a calm, powerful declaration of cosmic order. Everything, Cleanthes wrote, is woven into a grand, rational plan, even the parts that seem painful or unjust to us. To align one's will with this universal reason was the path to freedom. His stoicism was like a glacier, silent, immense, and impossible to move. He was not a flashy speaker, and was even mocked for being slow of speech. But what he lacked in eloquence, he made up for in steadiness. And in stoicism, steadiness was everything. He eventually succeeded Zeno as the head of the Stoic school, not because he was the most charismatic, but because he lived the philosophy more fully and authentically than anyone else. His life was a kind of walking proof, a quiet testament that one could endure hardship without bitterness. Question: fate without rage, and remain grounded without ever giving up on the pursuit of wisdom. If you enjoy these explorations of ancient wisdom and the figures who brought it to life, please take a moment to hit the like button. It supports the channel and helps these ideas find a new audience. If Zeno founded Stoicism and Cleanthes gave it strength, it was the third head of the school, Chrysippus, who gave it its skeleton. Without him, Stoicism might have crumbled into a collection of vague ideas and forgotten porch lectures. Instead, it became one of the most rigorous and comprehensive philosophical systems in the ancient world. Thanks to a man who was so prolific, he reportedly wrote over 700 books, though nearly all are now lost. His influence was undeniable. Chrysippus was a logician of relentless, almost obsessive genius. He didn't just inherit the school from Cleanthes, he rebuilt it from the ground up. He believed that if Stoicism was to survive and compete with other schools like the Epicureans and the skeptics, it couldn't just rely on tradition or poetic hymns. It had to be logically ironclad, no loopholes, no fluff. He refined Stoic physics, metaphysics, and ethics into a towering, interconnected system. He expanded on the dichotomy of control, clarified the nature of virtue, and delved deep into the logic of fate and causality. He argued that virtue alone was truly sufficient for happiness, not virtue plus comfort, or virtue plus friends. Just virtue. Full stop. But he wasn't just a dry academic. Chrysippus had a biting wit and was known for his love of paradoxes. He understood that living a good life was a difficult, often contradictory, endeavor. His life's work was to provide a rational framework that could help people navigate that difficulty with clarity and purpose. Thanks to Chrysippus, Stoicism hardened. It became more than a comfort for shipwrecked merchants or poetic boxers. It became a discipline, a practice you could study, debate, and use to cut through the confusion and chaos of life. And that intellectual discipline would soon find its way out of Greece and into the heart of a new global power, where it would be tested not in the classroom, but in the corridors of power and the battlefields of the Roman Empire. By the time Stoicism drifted into Rome, the philosophy had already weathered centuries of Greek refinement. But in the hands of the Romans, it evolved again. It transformed from a complex intellectual system into a practical art of living, a moral and psychological toolkit for navigating the high-stakes world of Roman politics and society. The Romans were less interested in abstract metaphysics. They faced wars, conspiracies, political exile, and personal ruin on a regular basis. They needed a philosophy that could hold their inner world steady, while the outer world was constantly threatening to collapse. Stoicism, with its focus on self-mastery, duty, and virtue in the face of chaos, was a perfect fit. Enter Seneca the Younger, a philosopher, playwright, and the reluctant advisor to the notoriously unstable Emperor Nero. Seneca wasn't born into hardship. He was a wealthy elite, brilliantly educated, and dangerously close to the center of power. And yet, his writings reveal a man deeply aware of life's fragility and the corrupting lure of comfort. In his famous Letters to Lucilius, Seneca preached restraint, mindfulness, and simplicity. He warned against being ruled by anger, fear, or desire. And yet, his own life was a constant, messy battlefield between his Stoic ideals and the compromises of political reality. He amassed incredible wealth even as he wrote about frugality. He served a tyrant even while writing about virtue. But rather than discredit him, this tension makes him one of the most relatable of the Stoics. Seneca didn't pose as a perfect sage. He was painfully aware of his own contradictions. His advice often came with a quiet self-rebuke. "I am not a wise man," he effectively wrote, "but a lover of wisdom." And maybe that's the most Stoic thing of all, not to claim mastery, but to pursue it humbly, day after day. While Seneca offered Stoicism to the elite, another Roman gave it to everyone else. Epictetus. His story is the inverse of Seneca's. Born a slave, he was crippled for much of his life and owned nothing, not even his own body. And yet, from this position of utter powerlessness, he taught that true freedom is always internal. "You may chain my leg," he said, "but not even Zeus can conquer my prohairesis, my faculty of choice, my will." To Epictetus, life's hardships weren't obstacles to be resented. They were training grounds for virtue. Every insult, every setback, every loss was an opportunity to practice courage, patience, and resilience. His teachings, preserved by his student Arrian, became a powerful manual for inner liberation. In Rome, Stoicism was no longer just philosophy. It was armor, mental armor, and soon, that armor would be worn by the man who ruled the known world. It's one thing to read philosophy in peace. It's another thing entirely to write it on the front lines of a brutal war, while ruling an empire that seems to be crumbling at its edges. Marcus Aurelius, crowned emperor of Rome in 161 AD, was a man born into unimaginable privilege, and yet his reign was anything but comfortable. Plagues swept across the empire, killing millions. Germanic tribes constantly pushed at the northern borders, requiring years of difficult campaigns. His co-emperor died early. A trusted general betrayed him and launched a rebellion. And perhaps worst of all, his own son, Commodus, would grow into the kind of tyrant he had hoped never to raise. Amid all this chaos, Marcus didn't write speeches or propaganda. He wrote to himself in a series of private notebooks, later compiled as the Meditations. He carried on a quiet, unflinching conversation with his own soul, never intended for publication. These pages offer us an intimate window into a Stoic mind under siege. They read not like declarations from a throne, but like the whispered reminders of a tired man trying to stay upright. "Begin each day by telling yourself," he wrote, "Today I shall meet with interference, ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness." This wasn't pessimism, it was preparation. By anticipating hardship, he could face it without being thrown off course. He reminded himself that the actions of others stemmed from their own ignorance, not malice, and that his duty was not to control them, but to respond with reason and virtue. He practiced what we now call cognitive distancing. The things you think about determine the quality of your mind. He wrote, "Your soul takes on the color of your thoughts." He constantly reminded himself of his own mortality. Memento mori. "You could leave life right now," he would write. This wasn't to create despair, but to instill urgency and clarity. If life is fleeting, then every action matters. Despite commanding legions and managing a vast empire, Marcus was obsessed with his inner life. He believed you could be surrounded by chaos and still find a fortress of tranquility within yourself. If your mind remained anchored in reason, Marcus Aurelius didn't invent Stoicism, but he lived it more visibly and more poignantly than anyone before him. He proved that its principles were not just for philosophers in togas, but for anyone, even the most powerful man on earth, trying to carry peace into the battlefield of life. After the death of Marcus Aurelius, the formal school of Stoicism began to fade. The philosophy that had stood at the heart of Roman intellectual life for centuries quietly retreated into the background. The rise of Christianity offered a new, powerful worldview that replaced the ancient schools. And yet, Stoicism didn't vanish. Its core ideas on virtue, on duty, on self-control were absorbed into early Christian thought, particularly in monastic traditions. For centuries, Stoicism was a whisper in the margins of Western thought. But when the intellectual winds shifted during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, its ideas were rediscovered. And today, in our own chaotic, distracting world, Stoicism has been reborn. It's found in books, podcasts, and apps, repackaged as a practical toolkit for resilience. It's used by athletes to manage pressure, by soldiers to process trauma, and by everyday people seeking a way to find calm in a world of noise. The reason it has survived for over 2 millennia is simple. It works. It addresses a fundamental human need: how to find meaning, purpose, and tranquility in an unpredictable world. It teaches us that while we cannot control what happens to us, we can always control who we choose to be. And in a world that often feels out of control, that is a revolutionary idea. What is one Stoic idea that you find most useful or compelling in your own life? I'd love to read your thoughts. Thank you for joining me on this journey into ancient wisdom. If you found it valuable, please subscribe and share. Until next time, stay curious. Forget stadiums, sponsorship deals, and national anthems. The very first Olympic Games had none of that. There were no timers, no slow-motion replays, and certainly no celebrity endorsements. There was just dust, sweat, a sacred olive tree, and men competing in the nude for the glory of the gods. The year was 776 BCE, and the location was Olympia, a quiet religious sanctuary in southern Greece, dedicated to Zeus himself, the king of the gods, champion of lightning bolts, and, apparently, an enthusiast for athletic excellence. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Echoes in Time. Tonight, we journey back to the origins of the world's greatest athletic spectacle, to a time when sport was not entertainment, but a form of prayer. Before we begin, if you enjoy exploring the deep roots of our modern traditions, please take a moment to subscribe and ring the bell. And I have a question for you. What do you think is the ultimate purpose of sports? Is it entertainment, personal excellence, or something more? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's travel to a time when winning didn't earn you a medal, but a chance at immortality. To the ancient Greeks, the Olympic Games weren't just about flexing your glistening, olive oil-covered biceps in front of a crowd. They were, first and foremost, a sacred act of worship. The athletes were not simply competitors, they were pilgrims. And Olympia was not just an arena, it was one of the most important religious sanctuaries in the entire Greek world. Nestled in a lush, green grove called the Altis, Olympia was more temple than stadium. The entire site was a testament to the power of the gods, particularly Zeus. The most important structure was the magnificent Temple of Zeus, a colossal Doric masterpiece that once housed one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a gigantic, 40-foot-tall statue of Zeus, sculpted by the master Phidias from ivory and gold. It was said that the statue was so awe-inspiring that to gaze upon it was to forget all your earthly troubles. This was the divine referee, looming over every contest. The rituals began days before the first race was ever run. The athletes, who had to arrive a month early for supervised training, would begin the festival with a solemn procession to the altar of Zeus. Horkeos, Zeus of the oaths. There, standing before a fearsome statue of the god holding a thunderbolt in each hand, they would swear a sacred oath with their families and trainers present, promising not to cheat, bribe an opponent, or engage in any malice. Breaking this vow was not just poor sportsmanship. It was sacrilege, an offense against the king of the gods himself. Cheaters who were caught were heavily fined, and the money was used to build bronze statues of Zeus, called Zanes, which lined the entrance path to the stadium. Each statue was inscribed with the name of the cheater and his city, an eternal monument to their shame. And then there were the sacrifices, lots of them. The centerpiece of the festival was the hecatomb, the ritual sacrifice of 100 oxen at the great altar of Zeus. On the third day of the games, a grand procession would lead the animals to the altar, where their throats were cut and their thigh bones burned as an offering to the gods. The smoke, the chanting, the smell of blood and burning meat, it was all part of a massive communal offering. The rest of the meat was cooked and shared among the thousands of spectators, turning the games into a sacred barbecue on a divine scale. Fire was also central to the ceremony. A sacred flame, believed to have been lit by the pure rays of the sun using a concave mirror, burned perpetually at the altar of the goddess Hestia. This ancient tradition directly inspired the modern Olympic flame and torch relay. For the Greeks, every aspect of the games was steeped in religious meaning. Winning meant Zeus himself had smiled upon you. Losing meant, well, maybe you should have sacrificed another ox. The first Olympic Games may have started with a single-foot race, but things escalated quickly. What began as one man sprinting roughly 600 feet turned into a sprawling, 5-day festival of events that tested every aspect of the male physique: speed, strength, skill, and how well you could fight someone half covered in olive oil. Let's begin with the basics. Running. After the first event, the Tsar, a single sprint down the length of the track, more races were added to the program. The Diaulos was the ancient equivalent of the 400-meter dash, one length of the track there, and one back. Then came the Dolichos, a long-distance race that could last for up to 24 laps of the stadium, totaling nearly 5,000 meters. Imagine running that far in the blistering Greek summer sun, completely naked, no high-tech running shoes, no water breaks, just you, your feet, and probably some very uncomfortable dust. For those who wanted an even greater challenge, there was the Hoplitodromos, a race where competitors ran wearing a heavy bronze helmet, greaves, and carrying a shield. It was a test of not just speed, but of the strength and endurance required of a Greek soldier. A final, grueling tribute to the martial spirit of the games. But it wasn't all about speed. The Greeks adored combat sports, and their games reflected that raw passion. Wrestling, or pale, was a technical and highly respected affair. No biting or eye gouging was allowed, but pretty much everything else was fair game. An athlete had to throw his opponent to the ground 3 times to win. It was the cerebral cousin of the far more chaotic pancration. The pancration was an all-out, no-holds-barred combination of boxing and wrestling, where almost anything went: punches, kicks, chokeholds, and joint locks. The rules were simple. Don't kill your opponent, at least not intentionally. It was violent, brutal, and one of the most popular events. Boxing, called pygmachia, was just as savage. There were no padded gloves, just thin leather straps called hymantes, wrapped around the knuckles, leaving the fingers free. These were designed not to soften the blow, but to protect the puncher's hands. Matches had no rounds and no time limits. They simply continued until one man surrendered by raising a single finger or was knocked unconscious. It was less float like a butterfly and more survive with your teeth intact. For the ultimate all-around athlete, there was the pentathlon. This was a 5-event spectacle consisting of the long jump, discus throw, javelin throw, the stadion race, and wrestling. The long jump was unique, performed with stone or lead weights called halteres held in each hand, which athletes would swing forward to supposedly increase their momentum. The discus and javelin were not just about distance, but also about style and form, reflecting their origins as skills of warfare. And finally, the most prestigious and dangerous event of all, the chariot races, held in a vast arena called the hippodrome. These races, with 2 or 4 horse teams, were a spectacle of wealth, speed, and spectacular crashes. The interesting twist, it was the owner of the horses who was declared the victor, not the driver who risked his life. This meant a wealthy aristocrat could hire a skilled charioteer, and if his team won, he would receive the olive wreath and the glory. It was the ultimate display of status. Each of these events pushed men to their absolute limits, but they weren't competing for gold or money. They were chasing something far more valuable in the ancient Greek world: Kleos, eternal fame. If you were dreaming of participating in the ancient Olympic Games, I hope you were Greek, male, and very, very comfortable being nude. The games were sacred, prestigious, and about as exclusive as a Spartan wine club. The rules were strict. The requirements were intimidating, and the list of those allowed to compete was very short. First and foremost, athletes had to be free-born Greek men, not slaves, not foreigners whom the Greeks called barbarians, and certainly not women. The Olympics were a showcase of Greek masculinity in all its oiled-up glory. Competitors came from city-states all across the Greek-speaking world, from Athens and Sparta to colonies in Italy and modern-day Turkey, but they all had to prove their Hellenic bloodline. Citizenship was a birthright, and without it, you weren't setting foot on that track. And then there was the nudity. Competing nude was the standard for almost all events. Why? The reasons are debated, but it was likely a combination of factors. The Greeks believed the male body was an expression of divine perfection, and competing without clothes was a way to honor the gods and display that physical excellence. It was also practical in the intense heat, and it made it harder to cheat by grabbing an opponent's clothing in combat sports. Whatever the reason, it was a fundamental part of the game's identity. Training wasn't optional. It was a brutal, lifelong commitment. You didn't just show up at Olympia and hope for the best. Athletes had to prove they had been in continuous training for at least 10 months prior to the games. Then, they had to arrive in the nearby city of Elise 1 month before the festival began for a final, intense period of supervised training. This wasn't a casual pastime. It was a full-time job. Officials called the Hellanodikai, who served as both judges and organizers, would observe the athletes during this month and had the power to disqualify anyone who wasn't up to standard. There was no room for slackers. Now, about women, they were, with very few exceptions, banned from competing, and married women were forbidden from even attending the games as spectators, under penalty of death. Unmarried women, however, were permitted to watch. The one major exception was the priestess of Demeter, who was given a seat of honor opposite the judges. But that didn't mean women were entirely excluded from sport. They had their own separate festival at Olympia, the Heraean Games, held in honor of the goddess Hera. These games consisted of foot races for young women and girls of various ages who, unlike their male counterparts, competed fully clothed. In the end, the games were as much a mirror of Greek society as they were a contest of athletic prowess. Proud, patriarchal, intensely competitive, and meticulously regulated. To the casual observer, the games were a festival of sport and religion. But beneath the laurel wreaths and wrestling matches, something far more strategic was at play: politics. In ancient Greece, everything was political, including who could throw a discus the farthest. The games offered the perfect opportunity for the often fractured Greek city-states, the polis, to meet, compete, and engage in the ancient equivalent of international public relations. Winning an event didn't just bring glory to the athlete, it brought immense prestige to his home city. A victory was a billboard for your hometown's superiority, proof that your citizens were stronger, faster, and more favored by the gods than your rivals. City-states funded and trained top athletes as a matter of civic pride. Victories were immortalized in commissioned poems by famous poets like Pindar, and statues of the victors were erected both at Olympia and back in their home cities. An Olympic victor was a celebrity, a war hero, and a propaganda tool all in one. But the Olympics weren't just for flexing muscles. They were for forging alliances. Political leaders and diplomats from across the Greek world used the games as a neutral meeting ground. Treaties were negotiated, alliances were announced, and political deals were struck in the shade of the olive trees. Even military campaigns were often timed around the Ekechiria, or Olympic truce. This was a formal agreement, announced by heralds traveling from city to city, that all Greek states would cease hostilities for a period before, during, and after the games, allowing athletes and spectators to travel to Olympia in safety. In theory, it was a beautiful moment of pan-Hellenic peace. In reality, it was more of a polite suggestion. Some wars did pause, but the truce was occasionally violated, leading to fines and even bans from the games. Sparta, naturally, was famously banned on at least one occasion for its typically warlike behavior. The sanctuary itself became a kind of ancient leaderboard. Wealthy city-states that had won battles or amassed fortunes would build ornate treasuries at Olympia to house their offerings and flaunt their success. The entire site was a political and artistic arms race in marble and bronze. Even cheating had political consequences. If an athlete was caught bribing an opponent, the shame fell not only on him, but on his entire city, a black mark on its reputation in the fiercely competitive world of Greek rivalry. If this journey back to the heart of ancient competition is fascinating you, please take a moment to hit the like button. It helps these stories of our shared human history reach a wider audience. The games are over. The dust has settled. The crowds are heading home. But for a select few, those crowned with a simple wreath of olive leaves, life is never going to be the same again. In ancient Greece, an Olympic victory wasn't just an athletic achievement. It was a full-blown life upgrade. Winning at Olympia meant you had received the direct favor of Zeus himself, and that kind of divine endorsement came with serious earthly perks. Victors returned to their home cities as heroes. They were greeted by cheering crowds and parades. Statues were raised in their honor in the city square. Poets were hired to compose long, dramatic, and extremely flattering odes celebrating their strength and virtue. Some cities tore down a section of their defensive walls to welcome a victor home, a symbolic gesture suggesting that a city with such a hero no longer needed walls for protection, and the rewards were tangible. Many victors were granted free meals for life at the public expense, a far better prize than a gold medal, especially in a world where your next dinner wasn't always guaranteed. They were given front-row seats at festivals and theaters. Wealthy patrons would line up to be their sponsors. Their families would arrange better marriage prospects. They were no longer just men, they were legends. But with fame came immense expectation. Olympic victors weren't allowed to fade into obscurity. They became symbols, living proof of their city's greatness. Some were appointed as generals or sent on important diplomatic missions. Their bodies had earned them glory, and now their names had to carry that glory for the rest of their lives. For the Greeks, the ultimate prize was kleos, immortal fame. It was the chance to be remembered not just by your children or your city, but by history itself. And that's what made the Olympic Games more than sport. They were a forge for legacy. For over 1,000 years, the Olympic Games blazed like a sacred flame, held every 4 years with remarkable consistency, even through wars, political upheaval, and plagues. But even the most sacred traditions are not immune to time. By the 4th century CE, the world had changed. The Roman Empire had conquered the Greek world. The games continued, but their religious meaning began to fade. The Romans enjoyed the spectacle, but the idea of sport as divine devotion didn't resonate as deeply in a culture that preferred gladiatorial combat to nude wrestling. Then came the final blow. In 393 CE, the Roman Emperor Theodosius the Fat, a fervent Christian, issued an edict that banned all pagan festivals and cults throughout the empire. This included the Olympic Games. After more than a millennium of continuous tradition, the sacred flame at Olympia was extinguished. The temples were eventually destroyed or fell into ruin. Earthquakes and floods buried the site under layers of silt and sand. The sanctuary fell silent. For centuries, the games lived on only in legends and ancient texts, until the late 19th century, when that old flame flickered back to life. Inspired by the ideals of ancient Greece, a French aristocrat named Baron Pierre de Coubertin spearheaded a movement to revive the Olympic Games as a modern, international competition. And so, in 1896, the first modern Olympics were held in Athens, Greece, fittingly, in the very land where they began. Today's games are bigger, louder, and significantly more clothed, but echoes of the original still remain. The 4-year cycle, the sacred torch lit at Olympia, and the pursuit of excellence. And it all began with a cook named Koroibos, a single foot race, and a wreath of olive leaves. Beneath the watchful gaze of Zeus, what do you think is the most important ideal from the ancient games that we should carry into our modern world? Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you found it meaningful, please subscribe and share. Until next time, stay curious. The year was 1791, and the United States was less a country and more a very expensive, very fragile experiment. The revolution had been won. The ink on the new Constitution was barely dry, but the war had left behind a mountainous debt. The fledgling federal government was broke, and the most urgent question on everyone's mind in the temporary capital of Philadelphia was, who is going to pay for all this? Enter Alexander Hamilton, the nation's first Secretary of the Treasury, a man who didn't just love strong financial systems. He worshipped them as the bedrock of national power. Hamilton's plan was audacious: consolidate the state's debts under the federal government, establish a national bank, and, here's the kicker, raise revenue through federal taxes. And not just any tax, but an excise tax on a product he knew the country produced and consumed in vast quantities: distilled spirits, better known as the whiskey tax. To Hamilton and the Eastern elites, it made perfect sense. Whiskey was a luxury for some, a staple for others, and taxing it seemed like a fair and reliable way to fill the government's empty coffers. But out on the western frontier, in the rugged, isolated hills of Pennsylvania and Kentucky, farmers had a very different idea. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Echoes in Time. Tonight, we explore the first great challenge to the authority of the United States Constitution, a story of taxes, liberty, and a stubborn refusal to be governed from afar. Before we dive in, if you enjoy stories that uncover the deep conflicts that shaped nations, please take a moment to subscribe and ring the bell. And I have a question for you. What do you think is the fairest way to tax a population? Is it based on income, property, or the goods people consume? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's travel back to a time when a tax on whiskey was enough to bring a new nation to the brink of civil war. To understand why Western farmers exploded with rage over a whiskey tax, you have to understand the frontier mindset of the 1790s. Life west of the Allegheny Mountains wasn't just hard. It was a different world. Roads were often little more than muddy, impassable trails. News from the capital in Philadelphia could take weeks to arrive, and the federal government felt like a distant, foreign power. For these frontier farmers, whiskey wasn't a luxury item enjoyed in a city tavern. It was the very lifeblood of their economy. Transporting bulky crops like corn and rye over the mountains to eastern markets was nearly impossible. So, farmers did what they had done for generations. They distilled their excess grain into whiskey. A horse could carry only a few bushels of grain, but it could carry the equivalent of 24 bushels if that grain was converted into liquid. Whiskey was durable. It didn't spoil, and most importantly, it was a stable and widely accepted form of currency. In a region where hard money was scarce, a gallon of Monongahela rye could be used to pay wages, trade for nails, or buy a pig. The whiskey still in the barn wasn't just a piece of farm equipment. It was a bank. Hamilton's tax, passed in 1791, felt like a direct assault on this way of life. Worse still, the structure of the tax seemed deliberately designed to punish small producers. Large distillers in the East could pay a flat annual fee, which was more manageable and less intrusive. But small, backwoods farmers were taxed by the gallon. This required government inspectors, complex paperwork, and cash payments they simply didn't have. To them, it felt like a punitive measure designed by Eastern elites to crush their small operations and favor large, wealthy producers. To these men, many of whom had fought in the Revolution against what they saw as tyrannical British taxes, this felt like a profound betrayal. The war had been fought over the principle of no taxation without representation, and now a distant federal government was reaching deep into their pockets and their barns. They saw it as an attack on their liberty, their property, and their very survival. The seeds of rebellion were planted, not in the halls of Congress, but in log cabins and backwoods taverns, where the talk turned from frustration to open defiance, and it was all over whiskey. At first, the resistance was a campaign of classic civil disobedience. Tax collectors were ignored. Forms were left unfiled. But as the government pressed the issue, the resistance grew more organized and more violent. Federal officials trying to enforce the tax found themselves on the wrong end of angry mobs. In western Pennsylvania, the heart of the resistance, federal tax inspector John Neville became a symbol of everything the farmers hated. He was a wealthy landowner and a prominent figure, one of the few men brave or stubborn enough to actually try and collect the tax. Collectors working under him were harassed, threatened, and attacked. One was stripped, whipped, tarred, and feathered, and left tied to a tree in the woods, a frontier fashion statement with a very clear message: go home. When the federal courts in Philadelphia issued subpoenas for distillers who had failed to pay, the situation escalated. UCA Marshal David Lennox, tasked with serving these rights, became a target. For the farmers, being summoned to a federal court hundreds of miles away in Philadelphia was an impossible burden, equivalent to financial ruin. It felt like another deliberate tactic to punish them. By 1794, this was no longer a protest. It was an open insurrection. The flashpoint came in July of that year, when Marshal Lennox, accompanied by John Neville, attempted to serve a writ at the farm of William Miller. An armed group of farmers intercepted them. A shot was fired. It's unclear by whom, and the officials were forced to retreat. The next day, the rebellion exploded. A mob of several hundred armed men, some of them decorated Revolutionary War veterans, surrounded Neville's fortified home, Bower Hill. They demanded he resign his post and hand over his tax records. Neville refused, and a gun battle erupted. The rebels, now numbering close to 600, set fire to Neville's home and outbuildings. A rebel leader was killed, and Neville's defenders, a small group of soldiers from nearby Fort Pitt, were forced to surrender. Bower Hill was burned to the ground. The message was unmistakable. The frontier was not bluffing. This was no longer about attacks. It was about who held power. In the days that followed, the resistance coalesced into a full-blown mobilization. A rebel militia of nearly 7,000 men gathered outside Pittsburgh, calling themselves the Defenders of Liberty, and proudly flying a flag with 6 stripes, representing the rebellious counties. They talked of secession, of forming a new country west of the mountains. To many in the federal government, it was beginning to look like Shays' Rebellion all over again, but with more guns, better organization, and a lot more whiskey. This was the first great test of the new American Constitution. The question was no longer whether the government had the right to tax, but whether it had the power to govern at all. If you're finding this story about the fragile beginnings of a nation compelling, please take a moment to hit the like button. It supports our channel and helps us bring more of these crucial histories to light. By the fall of 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion had escalated from a regional disturbance to a direct challenge to the authority of the United States. In Philadelphia, President George Washington watched with growing alarm as his carefully stitched republic began to unravel at the seams. This was no ordinary law and order situation. It was a constitutional crisis. Washington understood precisely what was at stake. If the rebellion succeeded, or if the federal government failed to respond decisively, it would set a disastrous precedent. It would signal to the entire nation and to the world that the laws of the United States could be defied with impunity. The young republic could fracture before it even had a chance to stand on its own 2 feet. Urged on by his hawkish Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, Washington made a decision that stunned the nation. He would not just send a message, he would deliver it in person. He decided to lead the army himself. Washington thus became, and remains, the only sitting U.S. president to personally command troops in the field. For a man who had famously relinquished power after the Revolution, this was not an act of ego. It was an act of grim necessity. He wanted to demonstrate, in the most powerful way possible, that the Constitution was not just a piece of parchment. It had muscle. Washington mobilized a massive federalized militia of nearly 13,000 troops, an army larger than the one he had commanded at Yorktown. Militiamen from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia were called up. They assembled as they had in 1776, except this time, they weren't marching against the British. They were marching west to face their own countrymen. Washington rode out in his full military uniform, a solemn and imposing figure. His presence was intended to intimidate, and it worked. As word of the massive army marching westward spread through the frontier, the rebellion began to dissolve. The fiery rhetoric and brave talk of secession evaporated in the face of overwhelming federal force. Many of the rebels had assumed the government would send a few marshals or write some angry letters. They had not expected the President of the United States at the head of a formidable army. By the time the federal troops reached western Pennsylvania, most of the rebellion had melted away into the hills. Its leaders had either fled or gone into hiding. Local support for the cause vanished. The show of force had succeeded without a single major battle. Once he was certain the region was secured, Washington handed command over to General Light Horse Harry Lee and returned to Philadelphia. His point had been made with crystal clarity. The federal government had the right to pass laws, and it had the power to enforce them. When Washington's army arrived in western Pennsylvania, they didn't find a battlefield. they found silence. The rebel militias had vanished, and towns that once brimmed with fiery anti-tax sentiment now greeted federal troops with suspiciously polite smiles. The rebellion had ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. But justice, or at least the appearance of it, still had to be served. Federal troops began rounding up suspected rebels, ultimately arresting over 150 men. Many of them were more confused than combative, swept up for simply being in the wrong tavern at the wrong time. The government wanted to show it meant business, but it also needed to avoid looking like a tyrant crushing poor farmers. It was a delicate balance. The arrested men were marched back east for trial in a grim procession that was meant to be a public display of federal authority. In the end, only 2 men were convicted of treason, a capital offense, and then, in a final, masterful act of political wisdom, Washington pardoned both of them. Why? Because Washington understood that sometimes unity is more important than punishment. He had already made his point. The law had been defended. The Constitution had held firm. Executing a couple of whiskey rebels would have gained nothing. It might have turned them into martyrs, inflamed public opinion, and reignited the flames of resistance. Instead, Washington extended mercy. It was a calculated move, but also characteristic of his leadership style. Firm in principle, but restrained in action. His goal was not vengeance. It was precedent, and that precedent was now crystal clear. The federal government had the authority to govern all its citizens, and it would use force if necessary, but it would also temper that power with prudence. For many on the frontier, however, the rebellion and its suppression confirmed their worst fears, that the federal government was a tool of Eastern elites who cared little for their lives and livelihoods. The resentment simmered, and it would soon find a powerful new voice in the political arena. The muskets were quiet, the rebels had dispersed, but politically, the real battle was just beginning. The Whiskey Rebellion didn't just test federal authority, it exposed the deep fractures in the new republic's identity. And at the center of this divide were 2 towering figures with wildly different visions for America's soul: Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton, the architect of the whiskey tax, saw the rebellion's suppression as a resounding victory for order and national survival. For him, the show of force was proof that a strong central government was essential. His ideal America was industrial, commercially powerful, and respected on the world stage. The rebellion was, in his eyes, a dangerous bout of lawlessness that had to be put down decisively. But Jefferson saw something entirely different. Jefferson, who had been serving as Secretary of State, was appalled not by the rebellion itself, but by the government's military response to Jefferson and his growing base of agrarian supporters. Sending a 13,000-man army to confront angry farmers over a liquor tax looked terrifyingly like the actions of a European monarchy. This wasn't enforcement, it was intimidation. He feared Hamilton's vision would create a nation run by bankers and wealthy merchants, not by the independent, virtuous farmers he saw as the bedrock of the Republic. The Whiskey Rebellion became political ammunition. Jefferson and his ally, James Madison, began to organize formal opposition to Hamilton's Federalist policies. Their movement, soon to be known as the Democratic Republican Party, framed themselves as the protectors of liberty, the rights of states, and the common man against an overreaching federal government. The Federalists, in turn, painted Jefferson's camp as dangerous radicals and mob sympathizers who would plunge the nation into chaos. The rebellion, in other words, crystallized America's first political parties. Lines were drawn, newspapers took sides. The debate over the whiskey tax became shorthand for a much larger struggle between centralized power and local autonomy, between the Hamiltonian vision of a strong, unified nation and the Jeffersonian vision of a decentralized confederation of sovereign states. So while the rebellion was crushed militarily, it lived on politically, becoming a foundational story that both parties would retell to their advantage For Federalists, it was a story of how the Constitution held firm against anarchy. For Democratic Republicans, it was a story of how a powerful government had overstepped its bounds and threatened the very liberties the revolution had been fought to secure. After all the drama, the military march, and the political fallout, the whiskey tax itself had an unceremonious end. Despite the government's show of force, enforcement remained difficult and unpopular in the western counties. The tax never generated significant revenue and cost more to collect than it was worth. When Thomas Jefferson won the presidency in 1800, ushering in what he called the Revolution of 1800, one of his first acts was to appeal to his frontier supporters. In 1802, the whiskey tax was repealed by Congress. The controversial tax that had sparked a rebellion and helped define the nation's first political fault lines disappeared quietly. With the stroke of a pen, the law had held, yes, but the people had spoken, and in the end, their voices, channeled through the political process, had won. The legacy of the Whiskey Rebellion is a complex one. It was the first and only time a sitting U.S. president led troops in the field. It was the first major test of the Constitution's authority. But more than that, it established a pattern that would echo throughout American history. The ongoing, often contentious, debate between federal power and individual liberty. It wasn't just about whiskey. It was about who gets to make the rules, who has to follow them, and what happens when people believe those rules are unjust. History may have aged the whiskey, but the questions raised by the rebellion still burn. What do you think the Whiskey Rebellion teaches us about the balance between law and protest today? Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the turbulent youth of the United States. If you found it meaningful, please subscribe and share. Until next time, stay curious. To a Viking, death was not the end of the road. It was simply the start of a far greater and far more uncertain journey. Life on Earth, or Midgard, with all its long voyages, bloody battle cries, and mead-soaked feast halls, was just a proving ground. It was a brief, brutal, and glorious test. What lay beyond was what truly mattered. And for the Norse, there were multiple destinations in the afterlife. Your final port of call determined not just by how you lived, but more importantly, by how you died. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Echoes in Time. Tonight, we sail into the mist to explore a world where a good death was the most important achievement of a good life, and where a funeral could involve a flaming ship, a sacrificed horse, and enough weaponry to arm a small village. This is the world of Viking death rites. Before we begin, if you enjoy these deep dives into the beliefs that shaped ancient cultures, please take a moment to subscribe and ring the bell. And I have a question for you. How do you believe a person's life should be honored after they're gone? What rituals or memories matter most? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's push our long ship from the shore and journey into the Norse understanding of eternity. If you died a warrior's death, blade in hand, with courage in your heart, and a battle cry on your lips, you had a chance to be chosen by the Valkyries. These mythical female beings, Odin's fierce and beautiful servants, would scour the battlefields and select the bravest of the slain to escort to the afterlife. Their reward, a place in Valhalla, Odin's own great mead hall in the realm of Asgard. But Valhalla was no peaceful paradise. It was an eternal training camp. By day, the chosen warriors, the Einherjar, would fight one another in glorious, bloody combat, honing their skills for the end of the world. By night, their wounds would magically heal, and they would drink and feast as if it were their last day on Earth, served by the very Valkyries who brought them there. Then, at dawn, they would do it all over again, forever practicing for Ragnarok, the final apocalyptic battle where they would fight alongside Odin against the forces of chaos. But not all of the battle slain found themselves in Odin's hall. The goddess Freya, a powerful deity of love, fertility, and war, also claimed half of the fallen warriors. They would dwell in her hall, Folkvanger, a beautiful field where they would live in honor. Though its daily activities are less clearly described in the myths than Valhalla's endless brawling, for those who didn't die in battle, the journey was different. Most souls who died of sickness, old age, or in an accident were believed to travel to Helheim, a shadowy, cold realm ruled by the goddess Hel. Helheim wasn't necessarily a place of torment, like the Christian hell, but it wasn't a party either. It was a gray, quiet existence, a far cry from the glory of Valhalla. This afterlife hierarchy mattered deeply to the Vikings, and so did the funeral itself. They believed that the right kind of funeral, performed with the correct rituals, could help ensure a soul's passage to the appropriate realm. They put enormous thought and resources into their burials, ensuring the deceased were honored, remembered, and above all, properly equipped for the journey ahead. Whether it was cremation on a flaming ship or burial in a great earthen mound surrounded by weapons and treasures, the dead were treated with deep respect and often a healthy dose of fear. If the funeral rites weren't done properly, there was always the risk of a restless spirit, a draugr, returning to haunt the living. And in the dark, cold world of the Vikings, that was something no one wanted to deal with. When we think of Viking funerals, we almost always imagine one thing: a magnificent longship set ablaze, sailing into the sunset. And while Hollywood certainly exaggerates, that fiery, cinematic image isn't entirely fantasy. It's rooted in a real and powerful Norse tradition. To the Vikings, a ship wasn't just a vehicle for raiding monasteries or exploring new lands. It was a sacred vessel for crossing realms. In death, as in life, the ship symbolized passage. And so, when a person of high status died, a chieftain, a great warrior, or a noblewoman, they were sometimes buried with their ship, in their ship, or on their ship. The exact ritual varied depending on the region and the era, but the symbolism remained consistent: send the soul off in style. In coastal regions, especially around Norway and Sweden, a common practice was to dig a large, ship-shaped trench in the earth. A real vessel, sometimes a grand longship, was then laid inside it. The body of the deceased was placed within the ship, often in a small wooden chamber built on the deck, and surrounded by a wealth of grave goods: swords, shields, axes, food, drinking horns, jewelry, and even sacrificed animals like horses and dogs. In some rare and high-status cases, sacrificed human thralls or slaves were also included, believed to accompany their master into the afterlife. After the body was prepared, the entire ship was often covered with stones and soil, forming a massive burial mound that mimicked the shape of the ship beneath. Some of the most famous Viking graves ever discovered, like the spectacular Oseberg and Gokstad ship burials in Norway, were found perfectly preserved beneath these protective mounds. But what about the fire? The dramatic image of a boat set aflame and pushed out to sea was likely a real, though probably rarer, practice reserved for specific coastal or island communities with a strong maritime tradition. In these cases, the body and grave goods were placed aboard a vessel, which was then pushed out into the water and set ablaze with tar, oil, and pitch. The fire served both symbolic and practical purposes. It was seen as a purifier, cleansing the soul for its journey. It was also a messenger, as the smoke was believed to carry the spirit skyward to the gods. And, on a practical level, it destroyed the valuable vessel, preventing its reuse and making it a true, final offering. That said, not every Viking could afford such a theatrical send-off. Ships were incredibly expensive to build and represented a significant portion of a family's wealth. Only the elite kings, jarls, and wealthy traders could be honored in such a fashion. Most common folk were buried in simpler ways. Still, the ship remained the most iconic symbol of Norse death rites, whether buried beneath the earth or consumed by flame. It was the ultimate vehicle for carrying a Viking from Midgard, the world of mortals, to eternity. because even in death, the sea still called. If you find this journey into the epic world of the Vikings compelling, please take a moment to hit the like button. It helps tell me that you appreciate these deep dives into ancient cultures. While ship burials might steal the cinematic spotlight, cremation was arguably the most widespread Viking funeral practice, especially during the earlier periods of the Viking Age, and you can trust the Norse to turn a simple fire into a dramatic, cosmic event. For the Vikings, burning the body wasn't just a way to dispose of remains. It was a sacred transformation. Fire was seen as a powerful purifier and a messenger to the gods. As the flames consumed flesh and bone, they believed the roaring smoke carried the spirit skyward, towards Odin, Freyja, or wherever their soul was destined to roam. Cremation typically took place atop a large wooden pyre, built with great care and intention. The body of the deceased would be laid in the center, dressed in their finest clothes, and surrounded by possessions that mattered most in life. Weaponry for warriors, jewelry and weaving tools for noble women, perhaps tools for a craftsman, or even a favorite pet. These grave goods weren't just sentimental. They were believed to be essential provisions, tools that the deceased would need to maintain their status and comfort in the afterlife. In some cases, a funeral feast or a series of rituals would precede the burning. Family and friends would gather, often for several days, to mourn, sing, and share stories of the deceased's life. Skalds, the revered Viking poets, might recite verses in their honor, weaving their deeds into the oral history of the clan. Ritual animal sacrifices were also common. Horses and dogs, animals of great symbolic and practical value, were sometimes killed and added to the pyre to serve as loyal companions in the next world. And the fire itself was huge. It had to be. To reduce a body to ash requires an immense amount of heat and wood. The pyre would rage for hours, sending a massive column of smoke billowing into the sky, a powerful, visible signal to gods and mortals alike. To many, it was a sacred and awesome sight, the visible gateway between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Once the fire had finally burned out, the remains, ashes, charred bone fragments, and melted or scorched metal goods were gathered with care. They might be placed in a ceramic urn and buried, or sometimes scattered across a sacred site. Often, the ashes were buried beneath a runestone or within a small burial mound, marking the site for future generations to remember. For the Norse, cremation wasn't grim or sterile. It was a release, a roaring, glorious exit from Midgard. It was a final, defiant statement to the world. This soul mattered, and now it rides the smoke to the gods. You wouldn't go on a Viking raid without your axe, so why would you enter the afterlife empty-handed? Viking funeral rites placed immense importance on grave goods, the objects buried or burned with the deceased, to aid them in the next world. These weren't just sentimental tokens, they were practical tools, status symbols, provisions, and spiritual passports meant to equip the dead for whatever trials lay beyond. For a warrior, this meant weapons, their best sword or axe, a sturdy shield, a spear, and sometimes even a full helmet and suit of mail. But these weren't always practical tools meant for continued use. In many graves, swords are found deliberately bent or broken, killed in a ritual act. This was a symbolic gesture, meant to release the weapon's spirit so it could accompany the soul. It also served a clever secondary purpose. It made the valuable weapon useless to grave robbers. Wealthier Vikings were buried with symbols of their riches, gold and silver coins, intricate jewelry, ornate drinking horns, and even imported luxury items like Frankish glassware or silk from the Byzantine Empire. Women of high status were often interred with beautiful brooches that held their cloaks, keys symbolizing their authority over the household, and tools of their craft, like looms and spindles. Children were often buried with small toys, knives, or animal companions. And let's not forget the larger accessories: horses, dogs, falcons, and even entire wagons might be included in a grave, and in particularly high-status burials. As we've seen, human sacrifices were not unheard of. It's a grim reminder that in Viking society, your status and your possessions, including people, clung to you even in death. Yet not all grave goods were purely functional. Some were deeply symbolic. A broken comb might represent personal grooming and dignity. A small hammer pendant invoked Thor's protection. A fishing hook might symbolize sustenance and survival. The choices were deliberate and often very personal. To a Viking, a well-packed grave wasn't a morbid ritual. It was a final act of respect, a statement of worth, and a crucial investment in the soul's journey to Valhalla or beyond. For centuries, Viking funeral rites burned bright, both literally and symbolically. But by the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the flames began to dim. A new power was sweeping through Scandinavia, one that brought with it a radically different vision of the afterlife: Christianity. As Christianity spread, it presented a new cosmology. Instead of Valhalla and Helheim, there was now heaven and hell, sin and salvation. Fire was no longer a sacred purifier. It was a tool of damnation. Cremation, once believed to free the soul, was now seen as a heretical act that denied the future resurrection of the body. Christian doctrine demanded inhumation burial of the intact body, facing east to await the final judgment. The conversion of powerful Viking kings like Harald Bluetooth of Denmark and Olaf Tryggvason of Norway dramatically accelerated this shift. These rulers weren't just concerned with their own salvation. Embracing Christianity offered significant political advantages: stronger alliances with the powerful Christian kingdoms of Europe, the literacy of monks to help run their administration, and a useful theological excuse to outlaw old tribal customs and centralize their own power. And so, the grand Viking funeral traditions began to fade. Cremation was outlawed. Human and animal sacrifices were condemned. The vulva, the pagan seeresses who once held ritual authority, were silenced or demonized. Pagan burial mounds were abandoned or, in a powerful act of symbolic conquest, built over with new Christian churches. This period of transition, however, wasn't swift or uniform. For a long time, many Norse people practiced a form of religious hedging. They would blend the two belief systems, burying their loved ones with both a Christian cross and a pagan Thor's hammer amulet, just to be safe. Some graves from this era show this fascinating fusion, a Christian burial with traditional Viking grave goods. But by the end of the Viking Age in the late 11th century, the old rites had largely disappeared. No more burning ships sailing into the sunset. No more sacrificial smoke rising to Odin. Instead, quiet churchyards, wooden crosses, and stone churches marked the final resting places of the Norse people. Still, the echoes of the past endure. In modern Scandinavia, ancient burial mounds still rise from the landscape like sleeping giants. And every time a longship blazes across a movie screen, we are reminded of a people who faced death not with quiet fear, but with fire, steel, and songs carried on the wind. What do you think is the most powerful way a culture can honor its dead? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for sailing with me on this journey. If you found it meaningful, please subscribe and share. Until next time, stay curious. The origins of the Venetian mask begin not with theater or pageantry, but with something far more fundamental: power, privacy, and the deeply human desire to be someone, anyone, else for a day. By the 13th century, the Republic of Venice was a global crossroads of immense wealth, cutthroat trade, and dazzling culture. But it was also a city of rigid hierarchy and constant surveillance. And in a place where everyone knew your name and your business, the most valuable commodity of all was anonymity. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Echoes in Time. Tonight, we pull on a mask and slip into the shadowy canals and hidden ballrooms of Venice to explore the history of its most iconic tradition, Before we begin, if you enjoy stories that delve into the secrets behind the world's most fascinating cultures, please take a moment to subscribe and ring the bell. And I have a question for you. Have you ever wanted to be someone else, just for a day? What would you do if no one knew who you were? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let the world outside fade away. We are entering the world of the mask. If the streets of Venice seemed enchanted during Carnival, it wasn't just the masks. It was the entire city surrendering to a grand and necessary illusion. For weeks, sometimes months, leading up to the austerity of Lent, Venice would transform. The normal rules of life, the rigid social hierarchy, the tight-laced etiquette, and the ever-watching eye of the church and state would collapse under a wave of music, laughter, and carefully orchestrated chaos. This was the Carnival of Venice, or Carnevale di Venezia, first officially documented in 1296, when the Venetian Senate declared it a public holiday. The festival likely had older, more pagan roots, possibly linked to Roman Saturnalia, a time when social roles were reversed and order was gleefully subverted. By the Renaissance, it had become the most famous and decadent festival in all of Europe, drawing aristocrats, artists, merchants, and opportunists from across the continent. Masked balls, or bals masqués, took place in lavish palazzi, their windows glowing with candlelight, the streets filled with jugglers, acrobats, fire-breathers, and the impromptu theatricals of the Commedia dell'arte. The Grand Canal teemed with gondolas strung with lanterns, carrying masked lovers to secret assignations. The air smelled of roasted chestnuts, spiced wine, expensive perfume, and Dean intrigue. But underneath all the sparkle, Carnival wasn't just fun and games. It was a crucial social and emotional release valve for a city so obsessed with decorum, social climbing, and public image. Carnival allowed Venetians to indulge in everything they were otherwise denied. Behind the blank, emotionless face of a mask, a servant could taunt his master without fear of reprisal. A noblewoman could sneak into a gambling den, a place normally forbidden to her sex and class. A priest could walk unrecognized through the rowdier parts of the city. The mask was a great equalizer, and in doing so, it was also a great destabilizer. Affairs bloomed, political satire flourished, and personal grievances were aired through songs, pranks, or anonymous letters, all under the protective shield of disguise. The ruling elite of Venice, a notoriously paranoid oligarchy, tolerated this spectacle for a very pragmatic reason. Carnival wasn't a true rebellion. It was a carefully managed illusion of freedom. The logic was simple. Let the people blow off steam for a few weeks, and they'll remain obedient and productive for the rest of the year. It was social control by way of seduction, and the mask was its crown jewel. Of course, there were attempts to regulate the chaos. The state passed numerous laws dictating when masks could be worn, usually from the day after Christmas until Shrove Tuesday, the day before Lent begins. Even during Carnival, masks were forbidden in churches, convents, and gambling houses during daylight hours. Though these laws were often ignored or selectively enforced, Venice, after all, was a city that thrived on bending rules with elegance. For Venetians, Carnival wasn't about becoming someone else. It was about revealing who they truly were, free from judgment and, for a short time, free from consequence. And with a mask on your face and music in the air, anything, absolutely anything, seemed possible. Among the many masks that populated the Venetian landscape, one stands above all others in its starkness and its power. The Bauta, with its chalk-white surface, sharp, protruding jawline, and complete lack of expression. The Bauta was designed not for beauty, but for pure, functional anonymity. It was less a mask and more a tool of social and political life. Unlike other Venetian masks, the Bauta was brilliantly engineered for practicality. Its unique beak-like chin jutted out away from the mouth, allowing the wearer to speak, eat, and drink without ever having to remove it. This meant your identity could remain a secret for the entire duration of an evening, or even a political meeting. It was typically worn with a black silk cloak called a tabaro. Black, three-cornered hat known as a tricorn. The complete ensemble created a uniform appearance that was unsettling and almost ghostly. A figure in a bauta was not a person. They were a presence, a shadow gliding through the narrow Venetian alleys. But what made the bauta particularly fascinating was that it wasn't just a costume for carnival. For certain official functions, it was required by law for all citizens, regardless of their social rank. In political assemblies, especially those involving the powerful and feared Council of Ten, the bauta was used to preserve total anonymity during voting. The idea was to remove personal bias, fear of reprisal, or political favoritism from the decision-making process. It was, in theory, democracy by disguise. Every man, from the doge down to a minor clerk, wore the same blank face. But of course, in the shadowy world of Venetian politics, this anonymity could also be weaponized. Behind the emotionless facade of the bauta, nobles could move unseen through the city, whispering secrets, seducing lovers, arranging underhanded business deals, or plotting against their rivals. The mask gave its wearer perfect plausible deniability. It blurred the line between civic duty and personal decadence. This duality made the bauta dangerous. It could empower an honest citizen to speak out against corruption, or it could shield a conspirator as he plotted treason. For the general population, encountering a figure in a bauta on a dark, foggy night was a deeply unsettling experience. Was this a powerful nobleman, a government spy, a common thief, or a jilted lover seeking revenge? You would never know until it was too late. Unlike the more theatrical masks, the bauta had no character, no smile, no frown. It was the anti-mask, faceless, formless, yet deeply loaded with meaning. And this, paradoxically, made it the most powerful mask of all. If you are intrigued by this world of shadows and secrets, please take a moment to hit the like button. It helps our channel reach more people who appreciate these deep dives into the complexities of history. If the bauta was the mask of power, the moretta was the mask of control, subtle, feminine, and bound in an alluring silence, worn almost exclusively by women. The moretta was a simple, oval-shaped black velvet mask that covered the entire face. It had no ornamentation, just a smooth, dark surface that contrasted sharply with the pale skin, then in fashion, drawing all attention to the wearer's eyes and hair. But it came with a strange and fascinating twist. It had no straps. Instead, it was held in place by a single small button on the inside, which the wearer had to clench between her teeth. This meant the moretta rendered a woman completely mute. If she opened her mouth to speak, the mask would fall off, and that is where the strange power of the moretta came in. In a society that both feared and fetishized female speech, this mask turned its wearer into a figure of pure intrigue, a silent woman in black velvet, unable to speak, to react, or to explain herself, became an object of intense fascination and desire. It allowed women, especially those of the upper classes, to move through public spaces in a kind of social force field, hidden, elegant, and untouchable. But this silence wasn't just seductive. It was strategic. Women attending mass, visiting convents, or going to secret assignations used the moretta to protect their identities. Courtesans, too, used it to maintain anonymity when mingling with powerful clients. In an era where a single scandal could ruin a woman's life, the moretta offered a shield of silence. The mask also symbolized the complex tension between female agency and societal control in Venice. On one hand, it allowed women a degree of freedom to move through male-dominated spaces without being harassed. On the other, it literally silenced them, reinforcing the ideal of the quiet. mysterious, and ultimately objectified woman. Notably, the moretta was considered especially fashionable in the 17th and 18th centuries, before falling out of use as ideas about female expression began to change. Today, the moretta rarely appears in modern carnival celebrations. Its enforced silence is no longer fashionable, but in its time, it was the mask that said everything by saying absolutely nothing at all. While some Venetian masks were tools of anonymity or political ritual, others emerged from the lively, bawdy, and improvisational world of Italian theater, specifically the commedia dell'arte. These traveling troupes of actors brought a cast of beloved stock characters to life with wit, satire, and incredible physical comedy, and each of these roles came with its own distinctive mask. Over time, these theatrical masks didn't just stay on stage, they seeped into the streets of Venice and became central to the spirit of carnival. Commedia dell'arte was wildly popular from the 16th century onward. Its cast of characters were instantly recognizable archetypes. There was Harlequin, or Arlecchino, the nimble and cunning servant in a patchwork outfit, his black half-mask featuring a sly, knowing grin. There was Pantalone, the greedy, lecherous old merchant with a long, hooked nose and furrowed brow. There was Il Dottore, the pompous, long-winded doctor who spouted nonsensical Latin and never actually healed anyone. And of course, there was the clever and beautiful maid, Colombina, who, like the romantic leads, often wore no mask at all, her own expressive face being her greatest asset. These characters represented human types that everyone in Venetian society could recognize and ridicule: lust, greed, ignorance, and cunning. During Carnival, these personas spilled off the stage and into the public sphere. People would dress as Harlequin or Pantalone, not just to play a part, but to mock real figures of power, to flirt more boldly, or to vent frustrations about society. By donning a commedia mask, a Venetian could make fun of a pompous official, imitate a cheating lover, or embody the fool everyone secretly pitied. And because these characters were universal, they were disarming. It was satire, slapstick, and social commentary, all wrapped into one. The entire city became a stage, and every masked face a character. For centuries, Venetian masks ruled the streets, symbols of liberty, subversion, and sensuality. But all empires fade, and by the late 18th century, the Republic of Venice was a beautiful, decadent, and teetering power. The masks that once dazzled Europe now faced their most powerful enemy yet, Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1797, after over a millennium of proud independence, the Republic of Venice fell to Napoleon's armies. The French occupation marked not just a political collapse, but a cultural one. Napoleon and his successors saw the Venetian carnival and its masks as a direct threat. To them, the masks were tools of conspiracy, rebellion, and disorder dangerous in a city already known for its political intrigue. What the Venetians saw as play, the occupiers saw as peril, so they banned carnival entirely. Masks, once worn by every class and creed, were suddenly illegal, except for private parties or official theatrical performances. Overnight, the vibrant chaos of Venetian identity gave way to surveillance and silence. The streets, once filled with music, laughter, and cloaked figures, now echoed with the boots of foreign soldiers. It was more than a costume ban. It was the end of a way of life. For centuries, masks had allowed Venetians to critique their leaders, cross social lines, and indulge in a second, secret self. Without them, Venice felt exposed and constrained, its theatrical soul stripped bare. For nearly 2 centuries, the masks of Venice slept, but not forever. In a remarkable burst of cultural revival and a savvy move for tourism, the city of Venice officially reinstated the carnival in 1979, and with it came the grand return of the mask. But this time, it was different. It wasn't about social upheaval or hidden sin. It was about art, heritage, and celebration. The reimagined carnival was spectacular. The old guild of mask makers, the masquerie, was reborn. Artisans began handcrafting masks in papier-mâché, ceramic, and leather. Each piece a unique work of art. The designs, once functional, were now flamboyant, adorned with glittering feathers, gold leaf, and swirling filigree. Of course, the modern carnival is not the dangerous, unpredictable masquerade of the old republic. It is safe, curated, and a global tourist phenomenon. But the magic still persists. For a few weeks each year, Venice remembers how to be someone else, how to walk in silence behind a mask, how to see without being seen. Even in the age of smartphones, that old Venetian spell mystery wrapped in elegance still works. Why did the people of Venice, for centuries, choose to hide their faces? At its core, the Venetian mask is about something profoundly human, the desire to escape one's assigned identity. In a world ruled by birth, class, and obligation, the mask was liberation. Behind it, a merchant could become a rogue, a noblewoman could become a gambler, a man could become a woman. The mask didn't erase your face, it gave you a new one. In this way, masks weren't just costumes. They were psychological devices, allowing people to explore hidden selves. There's a strange honesty in disguise, the kind that tells the truth, not by revealing, but by concealing. As our world becomes ever more watched and exposed, the mask reminds us of something we may be losing: the right to privacy, the right to mystery, the right to reinvent ourselves without explanation. So next time you see a Venetian mask, remember, it's not just a souvenir, it's a key to a city of shadows, a festival of freedom, and the ever-changing, ever-hidden face of human desire. What do you think? In our modern, digital world, do we still wear masks, just of a different kind? Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the heart of Venice. If you found it meaningful, please subscribe and share. Until next time, stay curious,